Picture a funeral. The air thick, the ground wet, and every pair of eyes fixed on you as if you walked in carrying a secret you never asked for. Now ask yourself this. What would you do if the first hand to reach for your father's casket was also the first hand to vote you out of the company he left behind? In this story, there is a moment early on where everything snaps into place. You will feel it when it happens. Think of it as the pivot, the point where the room stops breathing for half a second. That moment arrives just after my father's lawyer opens a sealed document. But before we get there, let me give you one thing to hold on to. Every family has an unspoken rule. Mine was simple: never let outsiders see the cracks. But that morning, the cracks were wide open, and the people widening them were standing right beside me. If you stay with me through these first moments, you will see the turn long before anyone in that room did. Watch closely. Pay attention to the shift in their shoulders, the tightness in their jaws, the silence right before someone tries to strip you of everything you were entrusted to protect. And it all flows straight into the moment when the leaves stuck to my shoes, slowing me down just enough to realize I was walking into a trap. The leaves were wet that morning, and they stuck to my shoes the way small things do when the world is trying to slow you down. I stepped out of my truck and felt the air bite my face sharp with that early October cold Ohio never apologizes for. The church sat quiet at the edge of the lot, its brick walls darkened by the damp. I stood there a moment with my hand on the door, looking at my reflection in the glass, the black suit that did not quite fit, and a tie Luke had knotted for me in the kitchen before we left. My face looked older than it had a right to, drawn at the edges like a man bracing for a winter storm he had no choice but to walk through. Inside the foyer, the heat wrapped around me and carried the scent of lilies and cheap coffee. People moved in soft clusters, hands folded, heads bowed, a murmur in the air like the sound of a busy truck yard heard from far away. When I stepped in, a few faces turned. Some nodded with sympathy, but most watched with something harder to name, something that lived halfway between judgment and calculation. I had felt that look before. It always landed on me the same way a cold hand lands on the back of your neck. Luke walked beside me. He was quiet the way he gets when he is trying to be a man and a son at the same time. He looked around the room, then looked at me, waiting to see how I would carry this. I gave him a small nod and started toward the front of the church. The casket stood there, polished mahogany, my father's picture on an easel beside it. He wore the same smile he used in every company photo, the smile that said, "Trust me, and keep your word and do the job right." Seeing it up close made the breath hitch in my chest before I could stop it. I remembered the mornings when he would stand in our driveway checking the tires on the trucks before the drivers arrived. He had a habit of tapping each tire with the side of his boot. If the sound was right, he would nod and move on. If it was wrong, he would crouch down and fix the problem himself. He used to say, "Machines tell the truth if you know how to listen." I could still hear the rhythm of those taps in my mind, steady as a heartbeat. The service began. Hymns rose and fell. The pastor spoke of legacy and endurance and the kind of work ethic men of my father's generation carried like a second spine. I tried to listen, but the words slid past me like static. Instead, I thought about the last time I saw my father alive, lying in the hospital bed with tubes taped to his skin, his voice barely a thread as he told me not to fight the wrong battles. He had squeezed my hand and whispered something I am not sure I fully understood even now. "Take care of what matters, Alex." When the final amen faded, the congregation drifted to the fellowship hall. The hum of conversation returned low and steady. I moved through the room, shaking hands and hearing the same sentences dressed in different voices. He was good to us. He was fair. He believed in family. I thanked them out of habit. Some meant it, some said it because that is what you say at funerals. Luke hovered close. His shoulders were tense under the navy blazer I had bought him for high school graduation. Every so often he glanced at me as if checking the lines on my face to see whether I might crack. Across the room, Preston and Dylan stood near the coffee table. Preston was talking to the bank manager using those measured hand gestures he practiced in every board meeting. Dylan folded his arms and nodded along, glancing in my direction between sentences. Their faces held the kind of controlled expression people wear when they are preparing for something they do not want to appear eager about. Harris, my father's attorney, entered quietly. He carried a leather folder and looked like a man attending to a duty rather than a grief. He met my eyes and gave a small nod, nothing more. We would talk soon, that much was clear. The burial was brief. The wind swept through the cemetery and rattled the last leaves on the trees. Dirt hit the casket with a muted thump that settled deep in my bones. Luke stood beside me, hands tucked in his coat pockets. He was trying to be strong for me, which made something tighten in my chest in a way grief alone never could. Back at the church, most of the crowd had left. Only family and a few close colleagues remained. Preston approached with the same careful expression he used whenever he wanted to appear reasonable. After the service, let us gather in the side room for a few minutes. Just family. We need to discuss the transition. The transition. He said it gently as if the word were delicate china. I nodded. My legs felt heavy but steady. Luke and I followed the others into the small side room with its wood paneling and mismatched chairs. It was the kind of room where difficult conversations happen because there is nowhere else for them to go. I took a seat near the center of the table. Harris sat across from me with his folder placed neatly before him. Preston settled at one end, Dylan at the other. Aunts and uncles filled the rest of the seats. The air felt tight, like someone had drawn invisible lines between us and no one wanted to be the first to cross them. Harris opened the folder and began reading from my father's will. His voice was steady and even. He went through the small gifts first, then reached the part that froze the room. To my son, Alexander James Grant. I leave all controlling interest and executive authority over Grant Logistics Incorporated. It is my intention that he serve as Chief Executive Officer and Chair. There was no rustle of fabric, no whisper. Just a heavy stillness that settled over the table. I kept my eyes on Harris, but I could feel Preston staring at me. Could feel the weight of it like a cold draft on the back of my neck. When Harris finished and closed the folder, he said he would complete the formal proceedings in the coming days. Then he stepped out, leaving the rest of us in a silence that felt thicker than the air we were breathing. Preston waited until the door closed, then looked around the table with a practiced calm. We need to talk as a family. He and Dylan produced a stack of papers already printed and neatly clipped. They passed them along the table. When one landed in front of me, I saw the title printed at the top. Family Advisory Vote Regarding Leadership of Grant Logistics. My thumb rested on the edge of the paper for a moment. The ink was still sharp, the formatting clean. This had not been thrown together in a rush. This had been prepared, carried here intentionally, planned long before the pastor spoke a single word over my father's casket. Dylan leaned toward me. His voice pitched low, almost sympathetic. People are nervous, Alex. Nashville did not go well. The bankruptcy, the drinking back then, banks remember things. We need stability right now. I felt Luke tense beside me. He shifted in his seat like he wanted to say something. I placed my hand on his arm without looking at him. Just enough pressure to tell him I had it under control. I took in the room. The tired faces, the folded hands, the cousins whose livelihoods depended on the company. The aunts who had watched me stumble more than once, and somewhere behind all of it, the echo of my father's voice telling me to take care of what matters. I slipped out of my coat and hung it neatly on the back of the chair. Then I sat again and let the weight of the moment settle. Let me understand. I said quietly. Dad is not even buried yet and you want to vote on whether his decision means anything. Preston spread his hands as if smoothing the air. This is not about disrespect. It is about responsibility. The company cannot run on sentiment. We need to show the board we are making thoughtful choices. A pen clinked against the table as Dylan set a cup of them in front of us. They were ready for signatures, ready for a tally. I picked one up. It felt strangely heavy for a disposable pen. For a long second, I looked at the line on the bottom of the page and felt something shift, not anger, not fear, something quieter. Like the moment you realize a road you have walked all your life has changed direction while you were not looking. Outside in the hall, a chair scraped across the tile. Someone laughed softly near the coffee urn. Life moved on while my father's family sat in a small paneled room preparing to decide whether blood still meant anything. I curled my fingers around the pen and felt the cold plastic warm against my palm. Whatever came next began right there in that silence. The parking lot lights flickered once as we pulled away, a faint pulse against the dim sky. Then the church slipped behind a row of bare trees. Luke sat quiet beside me. His hands folded in his lap, his breath fogging the window every few seconds. The farther we drove, the more the silence settled. Not the kind that pushes people apart, but the kind that lets truths rise to the surface on their own time. I kept my eyes on the road until the headlights washed over a reflective sign, then drifted for a moment. My fingers tapped the steering wheel without rhythm. A familiar heaviness pressed against my chest, the same weight I had carried years ago when I packed my life into the back of an old Ford and drove south with the windows down, hoping the wind would blow away the shame I did not know how to name then. Luke shifted a little. They planned that. It was not a question, more like an observation made by someone learning how the world works faster than he expected. I answered without looking at him. I know they did. He waited, maybe expecting me to say more, maybe wanting to understand the pieces I had kept quiet over the years. I loosened my grip on the wheel and let the truck roll to a stop at a red light. The glow filled the cab with a soft red haze. For a moment it felt like time had paused for us alone. When I opened my mouth, the first words did not come out. My throat tightened the way it used to before I signed those last checks in Nashville, hands shaking as I pretended everything would turn around if I just worked harder. The light turned green and I eased forward again, letting the hum of the engine fill the space where an explanation should have been. I could still see the old Nashville office in my mind. The dent in the wall where the filing cabinet leaned. The folding chair that pinched the back of my legs. The final notice taped to the door the day I came back from another meeting with a lender who smiled too politely while telling me the answer was no. Some failures sink quietly. Mine landed with the kind of thud that echoes for years. A thin ache moved through me as the memory passed. I had not planned for Luke to know that version of me. The broke version, the version running from phone calls, the version who showered at the community center on mornings when the landlord had locked the water line again. My family never asked about those details. It was easier for them to hold on to the verdict they had formed long before the dust settled. We drove past a row of closed stores, their windows dark except for the neon signs flickering in the back. Luke finally spoke again, softer this time. Why did you let them talk about Nashville like that? I felt his eyes on me, not judging, just searching. I kept mine on the road, because explaining it in that room would have been for me, not for Dad. The truth hung there quiet and steady. Luke took it in with a slow nod. A few minutes later, I turned into a gas station. I told him we needed a break from the drive even though the tank was half full. Inside the convenience store, the lights buzzed overhead. A coffee machine hissed in the corner. Everything smelled of cardboard and cinnamon air freshener. Luke wandered to the cooler for a soda. I walked to the coffee station and reached for a cup. My hand trembled just slightly. Not enough for a stranger to notice, but enough for me to feel the tremor move through my fingers. I tightened my grip, steadied it, poured the coffee, then closed my eyes a moment while the steam rose against my face. I saw my father again in the old garage. He was standing in that patch of winter light where dust hung like tiny He had asked me why I was running. I had snapped back that I was not running, I was starting over. He had not argued, he just wiped the wrench clean and told me quietly that a man does not outrun his mistakes, he faces them until they run out of breath. I opened my eyes and the store came back into focus. The coffee tasted burnt but warm enough to hold for a minute. When I returned to the truck, Luke was already inside his soda in the cup holder, his gaze fixed on the floor mat. I climbed in slowly. He looked at me. His voice was steady. I want to know what really happened. I let the breath out slowly. Some of it, not all. It was not one big thing I told him, it was 100 small ones, wrong timing, wrong partners, wrong decisions. I made mistakes, and when the ground cracked, I fell through it. He studied my face the way a son studies a man he is still trying to understand. The truck interior felt smaller for a moment, not from the space, but from the closeness of the truth settling between us. When I started the engine again, I felt his hand rest lightly on my arm. Not to comfort, but to reassure in a way only a son can, the way that says he is still here and not going anywhere just because the truth is complicated. The night thickened around us as we pulled back onto the road. The congress of headlights on the opposite lane blurred into soft streaks. I watched the dark fields roll past the horizon, stretching out like something both familiar and new. As the miles slipped away, I thought about Preston, the polished manners, the perfect resume, the applause he had gathered from relatives who confused confidence with character. He had always been the golden one, the one who spoke to bankers without breaking a sweat, the one who wore the suit as if it belonged to him from birth. I had spent years trying to outrun the shadow of his reputation. Somewhere along the line, I realized I was not supposed to be him. I was supposed to be the man my father believed in, the one who did not cut corners even when the world rewarded those who did. The highway lamps thinned as we neared the outskirts of town. A faint glow rose from the city in the distance, a slow pulse against the dark. Luke leaned his head against the window again. I could see his reflection in the glass, a mix of youth and something older settling behind his eyes. He asked a small question, then barely above a whisper. "Did you come back because of the company or because of Grandpa?" The question caught something in me off guard. I let the silence answer first. The truth weighed itself before moving forward. I came back because he asked me to. Luke nodded as if that was the answer he expected. A few minutes later, we turned onto our street. The house looked dim from the outside. The porch light had burned out the week before, and I kept forgetting to replace it. The windows reflected the headlights as we rolled in. I parked and sat for a moment with the engine idling, the soft vibration settling into the bones of the truck. Luke stepped out and walked to the door. I stayed a moment longer, reaching into the glove compartment for the registration papers. My hand brushed against something small and familiar. A metal keychain with the faded logo of my father's first trucking route. The edges were worn smooth from years in his pocket. I held it in my palm. It carried the scent of old leather and a trace of motor oil, faint but unmistakable. A memory wrapped in steel. I closed the compartment and switched off the engine. The quiet that followed was deep and steady, the kind that settles over a man when he can no longer pretend the past is behind him. The porch creaked as I stepped onto it. Luke waited by the door, the house light flickering behind him. I reached into my pocket and felt the keychain press against my fingers. Inside, the silence greeted us like a familiar guest. I set the keychain on the table by the entryway. It made a soft sound barely more than a tap, yet it lingered in the air longer than it should have. I stood there a moment, not moving, the house dark, except for a small lamp in the living room. Something about that small sound felt like the beginning of a truth I could no longer ignore. The air in the hallway held that early morning chill that seeps into your hands before you notice it. I closed the door behind me and let the quiet fill the space. Somewhere deeper in the building, someone moved a cart of metal chairs, each one tapping softly against the next. The sound echoed through the empty corridors of the church in a way that felt almost familiar, like the building had grown used to holding other people's unfinished business. I made my way back toward the reception room where everything had unraveled the day before. The carpet still carried the faint scent of flowers from the service. The tables were pushed into their original places, though a few chairs sat at slight angles as if they had not fully settled after the weight of yesterday's arguments. Light from a high window traced thin lines across the floor. The morning felt honest in a way the day before had not. Harris stood at one of the tables with a folder open under his hand. His tie was slightly crooked, something I had not seen on him before. He glanced at me, then at the doorway as if expecting someone else. He asked how I slept. I gave a small nod. Enough. He pressed the folder flat with his palm. There is still paperwork to finalize. Richard wanted every part of the transition to be airtight. There was something in his voice, a hesitation that came and went too quickly to name. I noticed a second envelope tucked under his files. Cream-colored, the kind my father used to keep in his desk. I did not ask about it, not yet. We moved through the documents quietly. The scratch of my pen filled the room. My signature looked steadier than I felt. The paper smelled faintly of ink and something older, like the scent of a drawer that had not been opened in years. Before we finished, the door behind us opened. I did not need to turn to know who it was. There is a certain shift in the temperature when someone walks in with a calm too carefully arranged. Preston stepped inside with his coat folded over one arm. Dylan followed, tapping at a screen on his tablet, the soft clicks echoing like a countdown. Neither of them acknowledged Harris. Their eyes were on me. I felt a small tightness across my chest. Not fear, not anger, just the familiar weight of something I had carried for too long. My hand rested on the table and I felt a faint tremor in my fingers. I curled them under my palm to steady them. "We need a few minutes with Alex," Preston said. His voice smooth, almost gentle, but his eyes held a different temperature. Harris glanced at me. I gave a slow nod. He closed the folder, gathered the scattered papers, and stepped out without a word. The door clicked softly behind him. Preston took the seat where my father had sat the week before the stroke when we had gone over freight projections together. Dylan remained standing, the tablet angled so the screen caught the light. Preston folded his hands in front of him. His gaze held an edge that was not there the day before. He waited long enough for the silence to settle, then began with a measured tone. "We all know the situation. Your financial instability in the past and the collapse in Nashville bring serious concerns about your ability to lead the company. We cannot ignore that." Dylan touched the screen and turned the tablet toward me. My bankruptcy timeline filled the display, dates, missed payments, closed accounts. Everything lined up neatly like evidence pinned under glass. Seeing it laid out that way hit harder than I expected. A single breath caught in my throat before I forced it free. Preston continued. "The family needs stability. The company needs stability. We believe a temporary reassessment of leadership is necessary until we can properly evaluate your capacity to manage inherited responsibilities." For a moment I said nothing. The weight of the file on the screen felt heavier than the device itself. My eyes drifted down as a flicker of shame moved through me. I pressed my thumb against the table's wooden edge, grounding myself before looking up again. I asked them a simple question. In the 2 months Dad was in the hospital, who signed the payroll? Who stayed in the office until nearly midnight making sure every driver and every dispatcher got paid? Who handled the federal reports the vendor holds the supply chain delays? The room pulsed with a stillness that felt almost physical. Dylan looked down. Preston's jaw tightened before he eased his expression back into place. I leaned back in my chair, letting the quiet hold for another moment, long enough for the truth to breathe in the space between us. Just as Preston opened his mouth again, the door moved slightly. A soft knock. Then Harris entered, holding the cream envelope I had noticed earlier. His face was composed, but his eyes carried a quiet urgency. "I apologize for interrupting," he said. "This concerns everyone in the room." He stepped forward and set the envelope in front of me. Inside was a printed amendment. The edges were crisp, the signature unmistakable. My father's handwriting in the margin caught in my chest like a sudden spark. Harris spoke with a steady tone. "Richard filed a revised operating amendment 2 years ago. It removes the clause that allowed family members to intervene based on personal judgment. Going forward, a successor can only be challenged with legal evidence of misconduct. Nothing subjective, nothing emotional, nothing like what you are discussing here." The silence that followed was sharper than the words themselves. Preston's composure cracked for just a second. His eyes flicked to the page. His fingers curled inward before he forced them flat again. Dylan shifted his weight, the tablet lowering a fraction, as if the evidence he carried had suddenly lost its value. "No one told us," Preston said, his voice thinner now. Harris replied calmly. "Richard had concerns about undue influence from extended family. He wanted the transition protected." The look Preston gave me then was something new. Not anger, not triumph, something like disbelief. As if the version of the future he had built in his mind had begun to buckle under its own certainty. He stood slowly, adjusting his coat. "We will review this." "Of course," Harris said. Dylan closed the tablet with more force than he intended. The sound echoed in the room. He avoided my eyes as he followed Preston toward the door. When the door closed behind them, the room felt bigger. The morning light had shifted, casting soft gold against the table and the envelope still open before me. The handwriting in the margin drew me back. My father had written one short line in ink that had faded slightly. "Keep it steady." I let my fingers drift across the words. The ache behind my ribs tightened, not with pain, but with something older, something like remembrance. Harris gathered the remaining papers and stepped away, giving me space. "Take your time," he said quietly. I nodded. He left. The room was silent again. The air smelled faintly of coffee from somewhere down the hallway. For a long moment I did not move. The sunlight shifted a little more, catching the frame of a photograph on the wall. My father in his younger years standing beside one of the first trucks he ever owned. The light reached his face just enough to make it look as if he were stepping forward from the image. I took a slow breath and walked toward the door. My palm rested on the cool metal of the handle. The faint echo of footsteps drifted from another part of the building. Outside, the morning was brightening, the frost on the grass melting into thin droplets that glinted like shards of glass. I stepped into the corridor, the quiet settling around me like a pause before something still waiting to unfold. The corridor felt longer on the way out. My shoes sounded soft against the worn carpet, a dull rhythm that matched the slow pull of my breath. Light from a high window fell in pale rectangles on the floor, and dust floated in it almost still. For a moment I just stood there with my hand brushing the wall, listening to the quiet settle against my shoulders. Behind me I heard the door open a crack. Harris called my name, not loud. Just enough to reach me without disturbing whatever was left of the morning. He caught up with me near the end of the hall. In his hand he carried the same cream envelope, now a little more bent at the corners. "There is more in here," he said. "Richard asked that you read it when you were alone. I thought about keeping it until next week, but after what happened in there, I think you should have it now." He held it out. The paper felt heavier than it looked. I slid a thumb under the flap and opened it enough to see the first line of my father's handwriting. The letters were familiar, slightly slanted, pressed into the page with more force than the note in the margin. I did not read further. Not yet. Some words deserve a place that is not a church hallway. I folded the envelope back down and nodded once. Harris understood more from that small gesture than any speech I could have given him. "If you have questions," he said, his voice quiet, "I will answer what I can." Some choices your father made, he wanted to explain in his own words. Outside the front doors, the light had sharpened. The cold reached up from the concrete steps and slipped into my cuffs. Luke stood near the bottom, hands in his pockets, shoulders hunched slightly as he watched a few cars pull out of the lot. His breath left small clouds in the air. He looked up when he heard the door. His eyes went to my face first, then to the envelope in my hand. "Everything okay?" he asked. I came down the steps slowly, each one creaking under my weight. Harris walked past us toward his sedan, giving me the courtesy of privacy. The envelope pressed against my palm with each step. "Your grandpa left something for me," I said. "We can talk about it at home." Luke studied me for a second as if weighing whether to push. Then he nodded. His shoes scuffed the gravel as we walked to the truck. When we pulled out of the lot, the church shrank in the mirrors. The steeple held itself against the sky, stubborn and thin. For a while we drove without speaking. The road curved past the cemetery where fresh dirt still showed a darker patch in the grass. I did not turn my head, but I felt its presence like a hand between my shoulder blades. It was Luke who broke the quiet. "Grandpa never did anything halfway," he said. His voice had that careful tone he used when he was trying not to sound too young. "If he left you the company, he knew what he was doing." The words landed deeper than he probably meant them to. I kept my eyes on the road and swallowed against the tightness in my throat. "He trusted me," I said, "maybe more than I trusted myself." Luke nodded slowly. He watched the view outside as the houses changed from older brick to newer siding, then to the small row of storefronts near our neighborhood. At home, he headed straight for his room. Exams were coming up and he hid in textbooks when he did not know what else to do with his hands. I stayed in the kitchen. The envelope lay on the table between a salt shaker and an old mug with a faded logo from one of Dad's trucking conferences. The house was quiet except for the soft hum of the refrigerator. Light from the small window over the sink fell across the table and cut the envelope in half, one side bright, one side dim. I sat down, picked it up, and slid the letter out. The first line started without greeting. That was like him. He spared warmth for touch and gesture, not for paper. If you are reading this, then I did not get the chance to say everything in person. My eyes moved down the page. He wrote about the first time he brought Preston into the office, how proud my aunt had been. How good Preston was with numbers, how quickly he picked up the language of contracts and credit lines. How easy it had been at first to imagine handing things over to him. Then his handwriting changed slightly, the lines pressing deeper into the paper. "I decided to test him," he wrote. "I gave him responsibility over a set of secondary accounts. Nothing that would sink us, but enough to show me who he was when no one was looking." He described the transfers he noticed, small at first. Consulting fees to companies he did not recognize. Retainers for services never used. Incremental amounts that would not raise alarm bells on a casual audit, but would add up if left unchecked. "I stayed quiet," he wrote. "I wanted to see if he would correct himself. He did not. The numbers grew. He went on to explain that around the same time his doctor had started talking about his heart more often. That combination, the numbers and the warnings, led him to Harris. They discussed the law in Ohio, the options for changing the operating agreement, the best way to make sure one bad decision could not undo years of good ones. I read the lines twice before moving on. "I know you have fallen," he wrote. "I know more than they do about how hard you hit the ground. I have watched you claw your way back without asking anyone for credit. That is why I trust you with this. Not because you never failed. Because you did, and you did not lie about it." My hand paused on the page. A breath sat in my chest and refused to move for a second. The air in the kitchen felt thicker, as if the walls had leaned in to listen. He wrote about hiring an independent accountant, a man from outside Columbus who owed no loyalty to the family. Quiet work, months of reviewing statements, vendor payments, routing records. The report that came back had confirmed what he suspected. Preston had been siphoning money through a shell he helped set up with a friend out of state. "I will not be here to finish this," he wrote. "You will need proof when the time comes. A full copy of the audit is in the safe in my office. Another is with the accountant. I did not keep only one. I know how people can be when they are afraid to lose what they think belongs to them." The last lines were shorter, as if fatigue had caught up to him. "Keep it steady. Take care of the ones who do the work. Do not let my mistakes become yours." My vision blurred for a moment. I set the letter down and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until the kitchen came back into focus. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Somewhere in the house, a floorboard creaked as Luke moved from his room to the bathroom. I folded the letter carefully. The paper carried a faint smell of his office. Coffee, old books, a hint of that citrus cleaner he insisted the cleaning crew use on the desks. When I stepped outside a few minutes later, the cold greeted me with more honesty than any condolence line. The sky had cleared. The light was sharper now, bouncing off the hoods of parked cars. I walked to the truck with the letter in my inside pocket and the keychain pressed against it. The drive to Grant Logistics took 15 minutes. Long enough for my thoughts to line up behind one another, short enough that they did not have time to scatter. The yard was half full. A row of trailers waited in their slots. A couple of drivers leaned against a concrete barrier, hands wrapped around travel mugs, talking about road conditions 2 states away. They lifted their chins in a quiet greeting when they saw me. I returned it, that simple exchange saying more than any speech could. The main building stood solid, its brick face catching the afternoon light. The windows on the second floor showed the outline of desks and file cabinets. Somewhere behind one of them sat the safe my father had mentioned. I stepped out of the truck and closed the door with a soft thud. The sound settled in the cold air and then faded. For a moment I just stood there, the smell of diesel and asphalt in my lungs, the weight of the letter against my chest. The wind moved across the lot, catching the edges of an old banner with the company logo. It fluttered once, then stilled. I took a breath and walked toward the door. The handle was cool under my hand. Inside the hallway, lights buzzed faintly, the same sound they had made for years. Each step carried me closer to the office my father had ruled with his quiet consistency. At the end of the hall, his nameplate still sat on the door. I reached for it, my fingers resting there a second longer than they needed to, feeling the raised letters under my skin before I pushed the door open and stepped into the dim room. The air in my father's office was cooler than the hallway, carrying that faint mix of paper, old carpet, and the last coffee he had brewed in the machine by the window. The blinds were half closed, letting in narrow bands of light that fell across the desk and the leather chair behind it. Dust lay in a thin film on the armrests, as if the room had been waiting with its breath held. I closed the door behind me and let my eyes adjust. The desk sat exactly the way I remembered from a dozen late-night conversations. Pens in the same mug, yellow pads stacked on the left, the small brass paperweight shaped like a truck parked near the edge. The only thing missing was the man who usually filled the chair. For a minute I stayed where I was, hands still on the doorknob, listening to the hum of the building. A truck rumbled past outside, the sound rolling through the walls like a distant storm. Somewhere in the operations bay, a pneumatic wrench hissed and then cut off. I walked around the desk and ran my fingers along the back of the chair. The leather was cool and smooth. I sat down slowly, feeling the way it gave under my weight. From here, the room looked different the way it must have looked to him. File cabinets lined the wall opposite drawers labeled in his tight handwriting. Vendor contracts, driver records, quarterly reports. In the corner behind the door stood the safe, waist-high, dark metal, the dial worn where years of hands had spun it. I stared at it longer than I meant to, hearing my father's words in my head. A full copy of the audit is in the safe in my office. I stood and crossed the room. Up close, the safe looked the same, until I saw the edge of the keyhole. The metal around it was scraped, small crescents of raw silver cutting through the darker paint, not deep but fresh. Someone had worked here with a tool that did not belong. I ran my thumb over the marks. The edges were slightly rough, catching at the skin. Whoever had done this knew what they were after, and they had taken their time. Not some kid playing with a lock, someone with a reason. The combination clicked easily under my fingers. My father had never changed that part, said a man should remember the numbers that matter. The handle moved heavy and smooth, and the door swung open with a low grind. Inside were the familiar things. A metal box with old family documents, a few envelopes with bank stamps, the deeds for the yard and the building, and a space where one folder should have been. There was a faint rectangular outline in the dust on the shelf. Nothing dramatic, just a cleaner patch where a file had rested for long enough to leave its shape behind. Everything else looked untouched. I checked again to be sure, moved each folder, lifted the metal box, felt behind the stack for anything that might have slipped. Nothing. The one thing I had come for, the audit my father had trusted enough to write into his letter, was gone. I stayed crouched there a moment, one hand on the frame of the safe, the other on my knee. My head dropped slightly. It was not surprise that moved through me. It was confirmation, like hearing a judge read a verdict you already knew in your gut. Someone in this building was afraid of what that report said. I stood and closed the safe. The handle thudded into place, the sound carried in the quiet room. On the desk, the phone sat on its cradle. I picked it up and dialed the extension for our IT manager. Mark answered after the second ring. His voice had that flat morning tone, not quite awake, not yet worn down. I asked him if the security system had logged any unusual activity during the funeral. He paused, said he would check, then put me on hold. The line filled with a faint hiss and the soft clatter of keys as he worked. When he came back, his voice had changed. There was a shutdown on the hallway cameras outside this office yesterday, he said. A manual override. It looks like it was done from inside the building. What time? I asked. Just after 2 in the afternoon, he said, right in the middle of the service. I felt my jaw tighten. My hand thumbed the edge of the desk. Who authorized it? There was another pause. His answer came slower this time. The system shows it was done under your login. The words hung there cold and clean. I let a breath out through my nose. My free hand rested on the back of the chair, gripping the leather until it creased under my fingers. I was not in the building, I said. I know, Mark replied. The access point is marked from the terminal in the second-floor conference room. Anyone with physical access could have used your credentials if they were stored on that machine. We have talked before about changing the policy on saved passwords. We just never pushed it. He sounded uneasy the way a man does when he knows the facts will not line up neatly for the person on the other end of the line. Can you lock that account down? I asked, and pull any footage that shows who went in and out of that room. He said he would. I thanked him and hung up. For a moment I stood there with the receiver still in my hand, staring at the photographs on the wall. My father shaking hands with a driver in front of a new truck, a group shot at the 10-year anniversary, an old black and white of the first tiny office they had rented, all crooked smiles and bad haircuts. I set the phone down and took out my cell, dialing Harris. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm, the background quiet. I told him about the safe, about the missing audit, about the camera shut down and the login. He listened without interrupting the way he had always listened to my father. When I finished, there was a brief silence. Richard said something like this might happen, he finally said. He did not know who, but he knew the report would make someone nervous enough to do something stupid. My hand traced the edge of the desk, nervous enough to break into a safe in his office the day of his funeral. Harris exhaled slowly. Fear does not have good timing. I asked him about the second copy, the one with the accountant. He confirmed it was still secure, at least as far as he knew. The man lived out of town, did not keep his files where people expected. Harris said he would reach out, confirm, and arrange a meeting. You should know, he added, that once this moves beyond the building, it will not feel like a family dispute anymore. It already does not, I said. We hung up with an understanding that did not need more words. The office felt different now. The quiet had a sharper edge. Outside the window, the light had begun to fade, turning from hard afternoon white to something softer, more blue. Shadows lengthened across the yard. A pair of trucks rolled in and backed into their bays, the beeping of reverse alarms puncturing the silence. Before cutting off, I stayed for a while going through drawers and files, not searching for more copies of the audit, just letting my hands move through the things my father had touched. Contracts marked with his notes, a small stack of thank you cards from drivers' families. An old photograph of my mother tucked behind a binder, her smile younger than any memory I had of her. As the building emptied, the sounds changed. Phones stopped ringing. Voices drifted away. The hum of the vending machine in the break room became louder in the absence of other noise. Lights switched off one row at a time until only a few remained. I checked the time on my phone. I did not feel ready to go home, not yet. The idea of walking out and leaving the office dark after what I had found felt wrong, like turning my back on a wounded animal and hoping it healed on its own. I called Luke to tell him I would be staying late. He answered with a simple question. Everything all right? I told him it was for now, that I just had work to go through. He did not push. He said he would eat leftovers and study. The normal things, when the last of the staff had gone and the building settled into its nighttime rhythm. I turned off the overhead light in the office and turned on the small lamp on the credenza. The glow was warm and low, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. The city lights outside threw a faint orange wash on the blinds. I took off my tie and draped it over the back of the chair, loosened my collar, sat for a while in my father's seat staring at the safe across the room. The empty space on its shelf seemed larger in the half-light. Everything in me understood that the missing file was not just paper. It was leverage. It was truth someone was willing to steal for. It was a line between what my father had tried to protect and what someone else was trying to bury. Along the wall was a worn leather couch he used to nap on during long days. I lay down on it, shoes still on, hands folded over my chest. The springs creaked softly under my weight. Above me, the ceiling tiles formed a grid, each square a piece of a pattern that had been there long before this moment, and would be there long after. The building made its night sounds, ducts shifting, a faint rattle in the vents, the distant vibration of a truck on the highway miles away. My eyes traced the path of the lamplight across the ceiling, then drifted clean. I did not sleep deeply. Every time I started to slip under, some small noise pulled me back. A heater kicking on, the elevator settling. Somewhere in the middle of that broken rest, I realized that this was no longer about whether my cousins liked the idea of me in this chair. It was about the bones of the company, about what kind of man I would be sitting in my father's place. Sometime past midnight, the building grew completely still. I listened to that stillness with my hand, resting on the keychain in my pocket, feeling the familiar shape of the worn metal. In the half-dark, with the glow of the lamp fading at the edges, I lay there and let the quiet close in around me, knowing that when morning came, I would not be able to pretend any of this was just about family anymore. The sound of the cleaning crew's vacuum woke me just before dawn. It hummed down the hallway outside my father's office, then passed a low dragon whine on the old carpet. I lay on the couch for a few seconds, staring at the ceiling tiles, feeling the stiffness in my back from a night in clothes that were meant for standing, not sleeping. The lamp still glowed beside the desk, its bulb throwing a tired circle of light. My throat felt dry. I pushed myself up, my shoes scraping the floor, and sat there with my elbows on my knees, letting the room come back into focus. The safe in the corner, the empty space on the shelf, the letter pressed against my chest in my inside pocket. There was a weight to all of it that had nothing to do with gravity. 2 weeks slid by after that night, each day carrying its own kind of pressure. Meetings with Harris, quiet conversations with department heads who had heard enough rumors to feel uneasy. Emails from the bank, polite but pointed. I moved through it like a man walking against a slow current, putting one foot in front of the other, knowing I could not stop or let it carry me. Somewhere in the middle of that, the date on the calendar came up in a way that felt almost out of place. Luke's 20th birthday. I saw it in the corner of my planner during a call with a vendor. The number sat there small and black, but it landed with more force than any email in my inbox. For a moment, the voice on the other end of the line sounded far away. I finished the call, hung up, and stared at the square on the page. That evening, I thought about canceling the dinner we had planned. My mind was still tangled in the missing audit and who had touched that safe and what would happen when the second copy surfaced. The idea of sitting under bright lights with music playing and people shouting at a game on television felt wrong, like trying to laugh during a fire drill. When I called Luke to suggest we move it, his answer was immediate. "Do not," he said. His voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "Do not let them take this too." I sat at my desk listening to the line breathe. Somewhere behind him in the dorm, I could hear muffled voices, a door closing, the clink of someone dropping change into a vending machine. "You sure you want to deal with me in this mood?" I said. He let out a short breath that was almost a laugh. "I would rather have dinner with you in that mood than not have dinner at all." There was not much to argue with in that. We picked a time and a place he liked. A burger place near the Ohio State Stadium, where the floor always smelled of fry oil and spilled beer, and the walls were covered in framed jerseys and faded photographs of games played before either of us were born. The restaurant buzzed when I walked in. Televisions mounted in every corner played a college game on mute. The crowd noise piped in over the speakers in waves. The smell of grilled meat and onions wrapped around me as I stepped up to the host stand. Luke waved from a table near the back under a big picture of the old stadium in winter. He wore a gray hoodie with the university logo and jeans that still had a bit of paint on the cuffs from some project in his engineering lab. There was a small paper crown from the restaurant's birthday stack sitting beside his drink. He had not put it on. I slid into the booth across from him. The vinyl creaked under my weight. You actually came, he said, lifting an eyebrow just enough to let me know he was messing with me. I shrugged. Somebody has to make sure you do not order the whole left side of the menu. We ate. Burgers, fries, a plate of wings that came with more napkins than we needed. The game on the screens went back and forth. Every time the crowd noise swelled, conversations paused for a heartbeat, then resumed. For a while we talked about small things, his classes, a professor who talked too fast, a group project that felt more like him carrying 3 other kids up a hill. It felt good to listen to problems that could be solved with extra hours and better notes. At one point there was a lull. He reached for his soda, then stopped halfway and looked at me a little differently. I used to be embarrassed, he said. About what? You, he answered, then winced at his own bluntness. I mean, when people asked what you did. I never lied, but I kept it vague. I knew about Nashville, about the bankruptcy. Mom did not sugarcoat it. I leaned back, letting the words settle. The noise from the televisions faded to a dull roar in my ears. He kept going, but I also remember you carrying me into the emergency room when I could not breathe. I remember you sitting on that ugly vinyl chair all night while the breathing treatments ran. I remember you holding the mask when my hands were shaking. People do not ask about that part. A line formed in my throat, sharp and unexpected. I swallowed it down. My fingers rested on the edge of the table, tightening just enough to make the wood creak. He looked at his hands. For a long time I thought those two things canceled each other out. Like your worst day erased your best ones. Lately I am thinking it does not work that way. He reached into his pocket then. His movements turned careful, almost deliberate. He pulled out his phone and placed it face down on the table for a second. His thumb resting on the back as if he was weighing something. I got an email from Grandpa a while before he died, he said. I did not know what to do with it. I thought maybe he meant to send it to you and hit my name by mistake. But after everything that has happened, I am starting to think he knew exactly what he was doing. He turned the phone over and unlocked it. His thumb moved quickly, practiced. After a moment, he slid the phone across the table toward me. On the screen, there was an email header with my father's name. The subject line was simple, for later. Below it was an attachment icon, 1 page. When I opened it, a document filled the screen, a scan of a single sheet from what I knew had to be the audit, columns of numbers and notes, at the bottom a signature from the independent accountant. In one corner, my father's handwriting curved across the margin. If you are seeing this, they moved before I could, he had written. Help your dad hold the line. The ink was darker here than in the letter he left me. Firm, decided. For a moment I forgot to breathe. The din of the restaurant faded. The edges of my vision tightened until all I saw was that short line in the margin and the rows of transactions. Payments to a consulting firm with no office in Ohio. Retainers to a logistics advisor whose address matched the shell company Harris had mentioned in passing. I looked up at Luke. He watched my face, trying to read it, his own expression caught between worry and something like pride. You never mentioned this, I said. He shook his head. I did not know if you wanted to hear from him that way. After he was gone. I did not even open the attachment until after the funeral. Then everything with Preston started, and it just felt like a live wire I did not know where to touch. He took a breath, slow and steady. I figured if he trusted me enough to send it, I had to trust you enough to show you. I scrolled slowly, letting the numbers and dates move under my finger. Each line was a small piece of a larger shape. Individually, they looked ordinary. Together, they pointed in one direction. Dad thought they would try to hide it all, Luke said. He told me in one of his calls that sometimes adults forget young people know how to keep secrets too, good secrets. He smiled a little. I think this was one of those. The weight in my chest shifted. It did not go away. It settled into a different place. I handed the phone back carefully, as if the glass were thinner than it looked. "Thank you," I said. He nodded, then looked back at the closest screen where the game had picked up again. A running back broke through the line, the crowd roar surging through the speakers. It washed over our table and then receded. We sat in that pocket of noise and quiet, two men at different points on the same line, both holding parts of a map an older man had drawn. After we paid and stepped outside, the cold hit hard. Our breath showed in front of us. The stadium loomed nearby, its lights off, but its shape unmistakable against the sky. Students moved in small groups along the sidewalk, laughter trailing behind them. I walked him back toward his dorm. The campus buildings rose up in clean lines of brick and glass. Windows glowed on different floors, each one a small square of someone else's night. At the entrance, Luke shifted his backpack on his shoulder. He looked awkward for a second, then stepped forward and put his arms around me. His grip was tighter than usual, like he was holding on to something more than the hug itself. "You do not have to beat them to prove anything to me," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. I let my hand rest on the back of his neck, feeling the familiar warmth there. The small tremor in his muscles. "That is not why I am going to," I answered. We stepped away. He pushed open the door and the warm light from the lobby spilled onto the steps. He turned once more, gave a small wave that said more than he would ever say out loud, then disappeared inside with the slow close of the glass door. I stood there for a moment, looking at my reflection in the dark surface. Behind it, I could see the faint shapes of students moving books under their arms, lives stretching ahead in long lines. The wind came up from the street, cool against my face. I slid my hands into my pockets. My fingers found the keychain in one hand and the edge of the folded letter in the other, the metal and paper pressed against my skin. Across the campus, a set of stadium lights blinked on for a late practice, white beams cutting through the evening air. I watched them a little longer, then turned back toward the parking lot. The crunch of gravel under my shoes marking each step as I walked into the kind of night that felt like the start of something I could not turn away from anymore. The elevator ride felt longer than usual. Maybe it was the quiet or the faint shake in my hand when I reached for the button. I had slept only a few hours, and whatever rest I found had been thin and uneven. The morning coffee in my other hand trembled just enough for me to notice, so I steadied it before the doors opened onto the 7th floor. The hallway outside the boardroom was bright with early sun, the kind of light that makes glass look colder than it is. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, I could see the interstate stretching in both directions, trucks pushing across the lanes like slow-moving veins. Some carried our logo, some did not. They all reminded me of the mornings my father used to stand at this very window, arms folded, looking out like he was measuring the pulse of the company by the movement of those trucks. I set the coffee on a side table and walked toward the conference room. The closer I got, the quieter the air felt, as if the building itself understood the weight of what was about to happen. My reflection drifted alongside me on the glass wall, shoulders squared, jaw tight. A man preparing himself. When I stepped into the room, conversation stopped. Not abruptly, just in that controlled way people quiet themselves when the person they have been discussing enters. Harris sat near the head of the table with a stack of folders. Keller, the chairman, was reviewing something without reading it. The bank representative stood by the window, hands clasped behind him. Preston and Dylan sat across from each other, both too straight in their chairs to be comfortable. Keller gestured for me to sit. His voice carried the familiar weariness of someone who had watched too many men try to outrun their own decisions. "We need to begin." I sat without speaking, folded my hands on the table, and let the room settle. My pulse was slow now, steady even with the strain I carried through the night. Preston was the first to fill the silence. "There are issues that must be addressed," he said, leaning forward as if sincerity could be built from posture alone. "The security logs show Alex's credentials were used to disable the hallway cameras the day of the funeral, and the safe in Richard's office was tampered with soon after. He delivered it cleanly polished the way he always did when he wanted the room to trust him." Dylan slid a folder along the table toward Keller, his movements stiff, his eyes avoiding mine. Keller read the page and looked up, his expression unreadable. He asked if I had anything to say. I nodded. "We should review the exterior cameras as well," I said. "Our internal system can be manipulated. The exterior system cannot." Preston's jaw twitched. He tried to smooth it with a slight lift of his chin. "The exterior cameras do not tell us who accessed the internal system." I did not look at him when I answered. "They tell us who was here." Harris reached for the remote. The screen on the wall flickered to life. A still image from the parking lot camera appeared. Then the footage rolled forward. The lot moved through time cars, entering and leaving, sunlight shifting across the asphalt. At 2:15, a silver Mercedes pulled into view. It slowed, then parked close to the entrance. The driver stepped out. The camera held the angle long enough for every person in that room to see the face. Preston looked smaller on the screen. Just a man in a suit stepping out of a car, unaware of the weight the moment would later carry. The room went still. I heard the soft click of the bank representative shifting his stance. A tiny sound, but sharp enough to cut the silence. Preston did not lift his eyes from the table when he spoke. "I came in to get a file. The timing was unfortunate." The bank representative spoke next, his tone polite but firm. "You were in the building, and the internal shutdown occurred moments later." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The weight was in the clarity. Harris opened another folder. Inside were copies of the audit summary, the duplicate my father had arranged to protect. The auditor sat quietly near the window, his hands folded over a worn leather notebook. He delivered his words like a man who had spent his life saying only what he could defend. "Your father saw patterns in the financial reports that did not make sense," he said. "He asked me to investigate privately. The findings show unauthorized payments to an entity with no legitimate activity. When I delivered the report, he said he would address it when his health stabilized." Preston did not raise his voice, but the coolness cracked. "You are now implying wrongdoing based on assumptions." The auditor did not blink. "I am stating what the numbers show. Ethics are not assumptions." He turned slightly toward Keller. "The report went missing from Richard's office. I provided the duplicate because he asked me to keep it off-site for this exact reason." The room shifted after that. Whatever balance had existed tilted sharply. Harris added the IRS findings. Keller looked older suddenly, as if the weight of the company's history had settled on his shoulders. The board members exchanged glances, their expressions restrained but revealing enough to see the direction everything was moving. The bank representative delivered the blow with that measured coolness only bankers have. "If these issues remain unresolved, our credit relationship will be suspended. Immediate corrective action is required." Preston said something under his breath, a protest that dissolved before it reached full form. Dylan stared at the table, his hands twisted together so tightly the tendons stood out like lines etched into stone. Then the vote came. Simple, quiet, final. Suspend Preston and Dylan from their duties pending investigation. Confirm me as CEO under my father's succession plan. Cooperate with all regulatory inquiries. There were no raised voices, no dramatic speeches. Just hands lifted and the sound of paper shifting as the decision settled into the air. When it ended, chairs scraped softly against the carpet. People gathered their folders. The auditor shook my hand. Once briefly, a gesture of respect without ceremony. The bank representative slipped out to take a call, leaving behind the faint scent of his aftershave. Preston walked out without looking at me. Dylan hesitated, his face caught between fear and regret, but the moment passed and he followed his cousin down the hallway. The room grew quiet again. Only the hum of the air system and the muted noise of the highway remained. I walked to the glass wall and rested one hand against it, the cool surface grounding me. Below, the interstate stretched in long ribbons of concrete, alive with movement. A line of trucks rolled across the lanes, their engines humming beneath the rush of air. One of them carried our logo. I watched it merge into traffic, its taillights blinking once before it disappeared behind a semi from another company. For a moment, in the reflection on the glass, I thought I saw the outline of my father behind me. Just a shape, a familiar posture, gone as quickly as it appeared. I let my hand fall to my side and stood there watching the highway move under the afternoon sun, feeling the room settle into that quiet place where consequences begin and everything else waits to unfold. The glass felt cold under my hand, and the trucks below moved in a slow, silent line, red and white lights weaving through each other on the interstate. For a while I just stood there and let my breathing match that steady flow, long in and slow out, until the noise in my head settled enough for the next step to appear. By the time I rode the elevator back down, the building had begun to thin out. People left in small groups, voices low, faces tight, in that way people get when they sense something bigger than them has shifted. No one asked me anything. They did not have to. News like this travels through a company faster than any memo. In my office, Harris sat across from me with a folder open, his glasses halfway down his nose. The pages inside were heavy with signatures and exhibits. Audit details, camera records, IRS notes. Enough weight on paper to pull 2 men into a courtroom and maybe farther. He tapped the stack lightly with one finger and told me there was more than enough to recommend criminal charges. Embezzlement, fraud, whatever the prosecutors wanted to call it. He laid out the path as he saw it, methodical and clear. Months of discovery, hearings, public filings that would turn my cousins into headlines and drag the company along with them. I listened, elbows on the desk, hands folded under my chin. There was a dull ache behind my eyes and a tension at the base of my skull that had not let go for weeks. When he finished, the room went quiet. I asked him what would happen to the business during all that. The drivers, the dispatchers, the families who did not have the luxury of wading through a legal war. He looked at me over his glasses and admitted that it would be hard. Banks do not like uncertainty. Clients like it even less. Both would stay if we managed expectations well. Both would sleep easier if the problem was contained without a courtroom. He said he would support whatever choice I made. That my father had trusted me because he knew I could tell the difference between vengeance and justice. He stood, then collected the papers and left me with my thoughts and the distant hum of the highway. 2 days later, I called Preston and Dylan. I asked them to meet me in a small conference room off the main hallway, the one my father had used for hard conversations that did not need witnesses. No lawyers, no board, just 3 men who had run out of places to hide from each other. The room was simple: old wood table, 4 chairs, a narrow window that looked out over the service yard instead of the highway. From here you could see the backs of trucks, not the fronts. Work finished, not promises making their way down the road. I arrived first and set 2 stacks of paper on the table, one on the left thick and heavy, one on the right thinner but no less serious. I sat at the far end and waited. Preston came in a few minutes later. He wore a dark suit and a tired face. Without the board in front of him, his movements were less precise. Dylan followed, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes darting once to the folders, then away. They sat across from me. No one spoke at first. The only sound was the distant beep of a truck backing up in the yard and the faint buzz of the fluorescent light overhead. I told them what was in the stack on the left, full documentation prepared for filing with the district attorney. Audit findings, security logs, bank correspondence, enough to keep them in court for a long time and maybe somewhere colder after that. I told them what was in the stack on the right, a negotiated exit, restitution of the money traced through the shell entity, full resignation from all roles at Grant Logistics. A binding agreement that neither of them would use the family name in any future venture. Preston stared at the table. Dylan stared at his hands. For a moment no one moved. Preston spoke first. His voice did not have the polish from the boardroom. It sounded smaller. He said he had grown up with everyone telling him this place would be his one day, that he had carried the weight of their expectations for years while I was in Nashville trying to salvage my own pride. That when the numbers got tight, he made choices he thought he could fix later. Dylan did not interrupt. His eyes stayed down. When he finally spoke, he admitted that he had signed things he did not fully read, that he had trusted Preston to handle the big picture and told himself he was only following orders. There was a flicker of shame there and something like fear. I let them talk. I did not argue. Their words did not change the math. When they finished, the room went quiet again. I told them the only thing that still mattered, that my father had built this company on early mornings and honest deals, that his name meant something to the men who drove through snow and ice under that logo, that I would not let that name be dragged through public mud if there was any other way forward, and that I would not pretend nothing had happened. I pushed the thinner stack toward them. I said they could sign and walk out of here with their freedom and whatever dignity they could rebuild on their own time. Or we could let the state decide what came next. Preston looked at the door, then at the window. For a second I thought he might push back from the table and walk out. Instead, he reached for the pen. His hand shook when he picked it up. He signed each page slowly like a man tracing the outline of his own exit. Dylan took longer. Sweat stood out along his hairline. When he finally added his name, the ink looked darker on the page. When it was done, I gathered the signed agreements and placed them back into the folder. No one stood. No one reached for a hand to shake. They left one after the other. No words. The door clicked behind them and the room felt larger and emptier all at once. In the months that followed, the company settled into a new rhythm. There were hard days, meetings with vendors who wanted reassurance, quiet conversations with drivers who had heard enough pieces of the story to know something serious had gone wrong. I answered what I could and left out what they did not need to carry. Preston and Dylan disappeared from the building. Their names came off the website, their parking spots filled with other cars. Rumors surfaced about where they had landed. A small firm in another state, some consulting work that stayed away from anything with federal oversight. I did not check. Some distances are better left unmeasured. The trucks kept moving. Payroll went out on time. The bank eased its grip after the first clean quarter. Life did what it always does when people show up and do the work. I began to see Luke more often, not as the kid hovering at the edge of family gatherings, but as a man finding his own footing. On Saturdays, when his schedule allowed, he would come by the yard. We would drink coffee in styrofoam cups and talk about engines and route planning and computer models he was building for his classes. One cool morning in late fall, I dug out the keys to my father's first long-haul truck. The old rig he had kept more out of sentiment than utility. It sat at the far end of the lot, paint dull chrome softened by years, but the engine still sound under the hood. I asked Luke if he wanted to learn to drive it. His eyes brightened in a way I had not seen since he was a boy. We climbed into the cab. The seat springs creaked under us. The steering wheel felt big and worn in my hands as I showed him the pattern on the shifter. His first attempts were rough. The engine bucked and complained. He laughed at himself, a real laugh that shook some of the weight out of the air. Easy. I told him, one hand on the wheel beside his. Respect the weight. Once it is moving, it does not stop on a dime. You think ahead. You give yourself room. He nodded like he understood I was not only talking about the truck. We rolled slowly around the yard in wide circles, the old engine humming under our feet. The morning light slid across the hood in soft bands. For a few minutes, everything outside that cab, the boardroom and the letters and the missing audits, felt far away. As winter came on, things inside the office grew quieter. Fewer emergency calls, more routine. I hired a new controller with a reputation for being boring in all the best ways. We rewrote some policies, tightened others. The building exhaled. One night, long after most of the staff had gone home, I found myself back in my father's office. My office now, if you read the nameplate on the door, the desk was the same, the chair was the same, only the pictures had changed a little. A photo of Luke at his last college game set beside the old shot of my father standing in front of that first truck. Outside, the streetlights cast a warm amber glow through the blinds. It fell across the papers on the desk and the old brass paperweight shaped like a truck. The hum of the city at night was a soft backdrop, steady and low. I stood by the window and looked out at the dark yard. A single trailer sat at the dock, its reflective tape catching the light in dull flashes. Somewhere in the distance, a horn sounded short and low, then faded. My hand drifted to the inside pocket of my jacket and closed around the worn keychain that had been my father's. The metal was smooth under my fingers, edges rounded by years of being carried. I held it there, feeling the shape of it, the history of it. For the first time in a long time, the tightness in my chest eased, not because everything was fixed or safe, but because the fight I had been avoiding for most of my life, the one with myself and my past, felt less like a battle and more like a conversation that had finally run its course. I turned off the desk lamp and the room fell into a softer shadow lit only by the wash from the street outside. For a moment I stood in that half-light, the outline of the chair, the desk, the safe in the corner, all familiar and quiet. Then I stepped toward the door, my hand closing around the knob, the cool metal steady under my palm as the sounds of the building settled into a silence that felt for the first time like it belonged to me.